Hi, I'm Kayla Hathaway, a partner here at Simpatico Studios. Simpatico is a platform dedicated to cultivating conversations and actions on complex social issues with professionals all around the world. On the Climate EDU channel, I interview academics about university programs, careers, research, internships, and published literature like books and papers. If you're interested in being a guest, we'd love to hear from you. And now, on to today's show. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Climate EDU. I am your host, Kayla Hathaway, and today I'm once again rejoined by the incredible Jeff Schlegelmilch. And for those who do not know who he is the director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia University. In this role, he oversees the operations and strategic planning for the center. He's also advised leaders on preparedness systems and policy at all levels of government and is the author of Rethinking Readiness. And speaking of Rethinking Readiness, today we are covering the fourth chapter of his book, which addresses cyber threats. Jeff, thank you so much for joining me once again on this fabulous Thursday. How are things on your end?
I'm doing all right. Always great to be here. Hope everything's going well on your end.
Yeah, things are going pretty great over here. And speaking of cyber threats, like I mentioned earlier, my software deciding to drop some frames, so we'll see how this goes.
Yeah. I assume it's non-nefarious causes, but you never know.
Here's hoping, right? For all we know, with next week being the election,
That's right.
could be some interesting things going on.
Yep.
Well, so let's just jump right on into it. Cyber threats. Let's go ahead and have a brief overview of the chapter, why it matters, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty details all throughout of it.
Yeah, so this chapter is obviously very, very pertinent, and it's something that is fairly new, although not quite as new as folks might assume, where our infrastructure is increasingly connected. We're increasingly wired to the internet. But even beyond that, we have these smart devices. Our phones have incredible data collection and data harvesting capabilities. We have voice activated systems in our homes. But even when you go to the hospital, some of the medical equipment you use is now smart per se. It's wired into different things. And this is really great when everything is working well, right? It connects various different aspects, makes our life a whole lot easier. When my phone pops up and tells me where I can get a cheeseburger nearby without me having to ask, that's a convenience I'm pretty happy with. But at the same time, it also raises concerns not only of privacy, but can also be used for more nefarious purposes, could be used by criminal organizations, and has really opened up a whole nother sort of pathway for what I'll call like great power competition, sort of the old, superpowers or powerful nations sort of fighting against each other. It's created more kind of non-traditional means of collecting information, but also of conducting attacks that aren't necessarily the same triggers and for a outright declaration of war that would have been 50 or 100 years ago. So a lot to unpack there, but we'll do our best.
As always, we'll go ahead and just try to do our very best in breaking down how complicated these things are. So first off, jumping right into it, you kind of we see in here mentioning how there's ransomware and malware attacks have becoming a lot more common, and especially now, people that are in IT, they go and have training in how to go and really deal with ransomware on computers because it just seems to be so common. Let's go ahead and tell us a little bit about what is this and just why is it just so everywhere now?
Yeah. So ransomware has become a fairly profitable kind of tool being used, particularly by underground or criminal organizations or even criminal syndicates with the cyber operation to them. And essentially what you do is you go in and you encrypt someone's data, and you don't unlock it until they pay you. And a lot of times with cryptocurrencies, Bitcoins and other versions that are untraceable, you essentially say, I've locked all your data, you can't get it back until you pay this ransom. And so actually, this was sort of not necessarily ransomware, but this sort of technique for folks who have seen Mr. Robot, right? Where they go in there and encrypt all the financial data. You don't delete it, you don't destroy it, you encrypt it. And if you don't have that key, you can't unencrypt it. Hospitals and healthcare organizations are particularly vulnerable for this because the impact of being down, of not having access to data, very quickly becomes a life safety issue. A lot of financial institutions, it's a very expensive proposition as well, too, where you have, just vast amounts of financial transactions occurring, every hour. That every hour you're down is very, very sizable amounts of money that are missed. But hospitals in particular tend to be targets because of the life safety issues that are created as a result of that. And it's being used a lot, partly because, you find a vulnerability, you grab the data, you exploit it. And it's also because a lot of folks are paying it. There aren't a lot of options there other than to pay it. And it's become a fairly lucrative industry, with it being one of the more concerning attacks that are occurring.
Yeah, and then just the fact that they can go and lock this data and be like, hey, so if you don't pay up,
Yeah.
HIPAA
Yeah.
violations everywhere.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, imagine trying to run a hospital and having integrated patient care. And that's sort of getting at the more integrated we are, the more our life is paralyzed without our data. And so imagine that someone goes in and locks up your phone and says, send me $1,000 in Bitcoins. Well, you're probably not going to pay $1,000. But if they say, send me $50 or send me $15, you're probably going to do it, right? And then you do that, the value and the inconvenience and the risk. And that's kind of what this does too, is it finds that sweet spot behind how much you're willing to pay, while it's worth it. And the more disruptive it is, the more worth it is for you to just pay them off to get your system back online. And it's really controversial, right? Because people wouldn't be doing it if people weren't paying the ransom. But what's the alternative, right? It's easy for me to sit here and say, oh, you shouldn't do that because it just encourages the hackers. But if you're running a healthcare system, if people's lives are in your hands or their livelihoods through your financial institution, it's a much more difficult thing to have. And so this is where, really when we start looking at this connectedness, healthcare industry and other areas, is securing these cyber systems is more difficult than it used to be too. There are more points of entry than there used to be, especially through various connected devices. You could have a really extraordinarily strong sort of defenses around your system, but if you have a laptop that's not properly secured, or even a device that's connected to the internet, that's connected through your system. We talk about these in the book under the Internet of Things. A lot of medical equipment, a lot of these things connected to the internet get plugged into these more secure systems, so that you can have integrated care. But when these are designed, they're not designed with heavy encryption. Some of them actually have manufacturer passwords for going in and doing maintenance. And it essentially creates a backdoor into a more secure network and has the potential to actually enter these more secure systems through these various devices that are plugged in to these larger system, more secure systems.
And like a question that I have, because by going and trying to make things more secure, but then you also have the threat of viruses or like malware.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have ransomware where it goes in and it just locks everything out and it's like, hey, give me money, and that's that. But malware is also incredibly like malicious, because like once it gets installed, like good luck depending on who designed this. And so a question I have is like, how can we go and like protect ourselves, or like institutions, like if we're looking at health and hospitals, for example, like what can be done to protect themselves from like malicious malware attacks?
Yeah, and really the type of attack that's being done depends on who's looking to do it, right? I mentioned, you have a lot of these like criminal enterprises looking to make money off of this. You have nation states that are trying to steal secrets and gather dirt on folks. You have really just sort of nuisance attacks out there, people who are out there to make you have to reformat your hard drive and things like that. Sort of this whole, the term is script kiddie, but you basically have these folks out there, out there just kind of screwing around and trying to cause trouble. But not necessarily with the capability of causing the larger types of things we've seen, like the Sony hack, which is believed to have been perpetrated by North Korea. But all this to say is that, whether you're an individual or whether you're an organization, there are a number of different things you can do. The first is to really make sure that you have everything properly secured. You have passwords, you have complex passwords, dual authentication. is actually really, really important for email accounts, social media accounts. That's where, in addition, when you sign on with a new device, in addition to you entering your password, it sends you a text message with that code, or it sends you an email to enter it in. You all of a sudden made it a lot harder. But then also think about what you have wired into it. Do you have a smart thermostat? Do you have one of those Ring or one of those doorbells with the camera that's connected to the Wi-Fi? What are their security measures? Does it come with a manufacturer's preset password? Every time you attach something to your network, that's a potential point of entry if it's not properly secured. So your front door may be locked, but your back door may be wide open, depending on what you have. In organizations, it's even more so. What do you allow in terms of access? Connecting over a virtual private network rather than directly can add additional layers of encryption. Actually, through Columbia, we have to do that to access a lot of our systems. We have to log in through a virtual private network. We have to have a dual authentication, multi-factor authentication to log into things. And these are all, again, ways. Of course, every time you add these layers, it adds another step before logging in. It adds another password you can forget. So there's also talk about creating like more profiles, ways where you have single points of entry. So instead of having everything linked to passwords and different passwords for every account like we've been doing, is to have this kind of multi-factor authentication, being able to get through into the system and have it linked more to your profile. And some interesting things on the horizon with biometrics. We've seen some initial things, right, with the thumbprint on the phone and the camera recognition, but there's potentially some interesting things to be developed yet there.
Yeah, and I was just gonna say, like, with iPhone, like, oh, I just look at it and then everything's there, which is really cool, but also one a bit concerning at the same time because I'm like, so all you need is my face.
Yeah.
What if there's like a doppelganger? Like, what happens then?
Yeah. And so that's why I say too, I mean, I think that there's some interesting things with biometrics. There are some weaknesses with it, the way that it's currently deployed. I think there were some things with the thumbprints, the fingerprints when that first got deployed. As the cameras get better and the algorithms get better, it gets more sophisticated. But, it's always this trade-off. How free and how easy do you want to be able to access everything on demand versus how secure do you want it to be? The other piece actually that I didn't mention is when there are updates, when you see those updates for Windows to update and you can pause it and wait a few days, it's actually really important to update right away. There's something called a 0-day exploit. So basically, when a vulnerability is discovered, there's a moment where it's been discovered but hasn't been patched. And when Microsoft or Apple or whatever system issues these patches, they're fixing a vulnerability. The problem is once they announce that they're fixing this vulnerability, they're also announcing that the vulnerability exists out there to the world. And so you have this window of time where folks are going to try and exploit that vulnerability before it gets patched, before it gets fixed. So the faster you are with those updates, especially those security updates, the less vulnerable you are to someone who just got the news alert and is writing a piece of code right now trying to find out how they can make money or cause trouble or do something else with that information.
I mean, good to know. Like, I was always of the mentality of like, oh, like you give it a little bit before you update, like just in case. But now, yeah, I'm not gonna delay on updating now. Thank you.
Especially if you look into it, I would say especially if there's security updates. Sometimes it's like feature and usability or bug fixes, things like that. But especially if there's a security update, a lot of times they'll flag it if it's a critical update, a critical security update. You definitely want to pay attention to those.
Got it. Okay, definitely noted. Um, and just since we have, a very important date coming up next week, talking about the importance of cybersecurity for elections and for how government, like how do we keep that secure? And I think it was it Ukraine, or there. I'm getting my countries mixed up. I remember that there was like a big cyber attack that really just messed up with like government, and that was like all over the news a couple years ago.
Yeah, Ukraine was really at the receiving end of a lot of cyber attacks, from shutting down their grid to potentially interference near the election. But so have we, and I think that that's something that's really important to point out. In 2016, we're seeing it in 2020 in terms of securing these systems. So there's kind of this is really like, when we see movies, we think about like, oh, we're going to take the grid down and we're going to make the whole planet go back to the Stone Age with the right piece of code. The reality is that you can cause a lot of trouble. And the book talks about some of those scenarios with shutting down the grid and really causing some damage with critical infrastructure. But the long game for really when we're talking about nation states, when we're talking about this great power competition, is more strategic. And so in this country, elections are administered locally and by the states. This is one of those really like it's not a federal responsibility. And in fact, when the federal government in 2016, when the Department of Homeland Security and the Obama administration was offering states assistance in securing their election systems, some states welcomed it, and other states said it's an overreach of the federal government. States are responsible for their elections.
Mm.
Normally, this is a good thing. It actually makes it very difficult to hack an election, at least a national election, because these systems are so decentralized. You can't write a piece of code, sneak in, and then change it and nobody know, right? It's done oftentimes administered at the county level within states. So it's different systems, different technological systems. That being said, what you can do is you can push out a bunch of disinformation about the election being rigged, and you can start playing with voter rolls. So people go to the polls and they can't find their names. You can take a look at the systems that are posting the elections and seeing it change and doing weird stuff. All this erodes at the confidence in democratic institutions. It doesn't help when one of the candidates themselves is eroding that in their own rhetoric. You can guess who I'm talking about. But all of this is designed not to create a detected, hey, we caused this attack, but it's to weaken the United States. It's to weaken and have us dealing so much with our internal issues that we're not in a position to see what's going on externally. And so this is really, I think, much more insidious and much more pervasive in what we're doing. And it's moved the front lines from these conflict among nation states into town halls and community centers and schools set up for elections, and the apparatus just isn't there to fend off an attack from a nation state at the community level. So yeah. And again, it's not to say we'll see the results of the election change as a result of this, at least not at the national level, but again, can really cause a lot of concerns that can erode our confidence in the process as a whole.
Oh yeah, I mean we're already seeing just with the whole thing of like mail-in ballots and everything like that. I can only imagine what the fears are over digital ballots submitting at the
Mhm.
actual voting booths, and um, it just makes me like really wonder. So like how like we don't actually have a dedicated like department of government for cybersecurity, if I remember
Yeah,
correctly.
there was a new branch within a new agency within the Department of Homeland Security that was very recently set up. CISA, I forget what it stands for. CISA. It's a
CISA. I haven't heard of this.
Yeah, it's fairly new. If it looks like I'm Googling this while we're talking, that's purely coincidence. Um, yeah, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. So
Ooh, okay.
essentially these responsibilities have been sort of dispersed across a lot of different agencies, but Homeland Security has been has been the primary coordinating agency, but it's been kind of in parts of the National Preparedness Directorate and in other sectors. And then so this new agency, the intent is to consolidate it, provide guidance, more centralization, and more technical assistance.
Mhm.
So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. It's certainly a long time coming to centralize this some more. But again, when you're talking a federalist democracy, a capitalistic society, a lot of this is incumbent on the individuals, on the organization, and on the states. And so how far there's a fine line between technical assistance and mandates for this, but it really also requires investment, and that's the thing. There was a lot of investment in electronic voting systems, and the problem with one-time funding is that the technology we had 10 years ago,
Mhm.
20 years ago, right, is even unhackable encryption 20 years ago now is we just have much more computing power to be able to get at that. And there's been evidence of voting machines able to be hacked
Mhm.
very, very quickly. Now, most of them aren't wired to the internet. You can't get at them from the outside, but it just demonstrates that if we're not regularly investing in the security of this, no matter how good it is at the time that it's deployed, it's going to go stale. Any state-of-the-art security system today is not going to be state-of-the-art for 16 years from now.
Yeah. And it also kind of brings up the question, like going back a little bit in hospitals, where you have like technology, like there's a lot of medical equipment that was built to run on like Windows 7.
Yeah.
And it just, that's it. Like you can't go and upgrade it to Windows 10 or anything because it was literally designed just for that program.
Yeah, yeah. So, and as you get new systems, a lot of times you'll get something deployed and then you need to upgrade it for security. But then you sort of get in this weird crossover between a medical device that is approved under very specific circumstances for very specific use. And so it has to be reapproved when you're upgrading software. Some of this stuff has been worked out, but some of it sort of remains. That healthcare is a particularly challenging environment. It's so complex and there's such a premium on having all of this information available and information to be able to sort through for purposes of billing, for purposes of diagnosis, for pattern recognition, which treatments are having more success than others. So it's actually really a very powerful force for good when everything's working right, when everything is secured. But again, the you're connecting so many different things for so many different reasons. It becomes a very, very complex system. And so it lends itself to vulnerability. It lends itself to, I'm not saying we need to go back in time. I think we're getting a lot more good than harm as a result of this. But it's kind of a lesson for society more generally, right? As we grow more and more complex and more connected, some things, they say have a paper backup, right? I was with a colleague, Dr. Redlener, we were driving in Texas during Hurricane Harvey, and he's like, can you get a paper map? And I was like, I got it on my phone. And he's like, no, can we just get a paper one, like in case we don't have service? And I said, no, I'll download it before we leave, so it'll be on my phone. So anyway, cut to the end,
Mm-hmm.
got a couple of maps. Down there. My phone worked while we were down there, but he was right. Anyway, so having redundant systems. But yeah, I mean, when you can do that, that's great. Not everything you can do that for anymore. And so it's important that it we can't it's cheaper to do a lot of things because of the systems we have and the cyber systems that have been developed, but it's maybe a little too much cheaper to do these things. Maybe we need to spend a little bit more money on security upgrades. Maybe we need to put a little bit less of a premium on rapid releases and a little bit more on the underlying architecture to make sure that we're not producing these vulnerabilities faster than we can secure them.
I completely agree, and especially when we think about like the future in addressing the climate crisis and how we're gonna have a bit like a smarter grid or like more smart homes and everything like that. It's like if we don't really focus on proper security, all it takes is like say hypothetical, right? Because you factor in human error and everything. You have this beautiful smart grid, your city's glowing, everything's wonderful, but it's all connected at one point. And it just takes one entry and the entire thing is shut down. And that's like something that this always worries me in the back of my mind. I'm like, what if we just don't take the proper steps and it just takes one like angry or bored
Yeah.
person to go and the city's blacked out, everything stops, like what do you do? So
Yeah, certainly the consequences. So I've heard mixed things on this. I've heard about, on the one hand, I talk about in the book how, there are a lot of manual overrides to these systems, but the more you automate, the less staff you have to manage those manual overrides. And the more even if you have different systems, the more you're using similar code, similar equipment, the more vulnerability for one can be exploited into another. The other is that a really sophisticated cyber attack is probably initially going to go undetected. Because what you're going to do is you're going to go in there and you're going to look around the system. You're going to look at these vulnerabilities. A lot of times it's not as simple as going in there and crashing the system. You actually need to, turn off different things in different orders to trick out the system, to make these the various rerouting and redirecting. Smart grids are actually great at keeping the lights on, right? They installed a bunch in my town after a couple of storms, and we barely lost power since.
nice.
The way that it kind of reroutes around where lines fall and things like that. So you have to sort of shut off different overrides and different things along the way. So the first attack goes undetected because you're basically mapping out the system. Here's where everything is. And then you're coming back and writing the code for the second attack, which is actually going to start knocking down those dominoes and pushing those key points in the right sequence and the right frequency. And so I always hesitate when people say, oh, well, that could never happen, because I'd be out of the job if things that could never happen never happened. But it's not as easy as people think. It makes for a good movie to shut it all down. But there's actually a lot of work being done to secure some of this critical infrastructure, but it's not evenly spread across all of the infrastructure.
Well, I'm definitely glad to hear that now that we have like a new department that's working on these things, and that it's not as easy as like, just button mashing and then suddenly everything goes
Yeah.
dark. And with that, like, this episode has flown by so quickly, and next week we have our final episode, and I think this one is on nuclear conflict.
That's right.
Will give
Every
us a
time I hear it,
brief
I think
preview.
there's this episode of The Simpsons where Homer corrects Lisa and he goes, nuclear. It's pronounced nuclear.
Nuclear conflict.
Anyway, it's yeah, no, and this is actually a really um one that, I mentioned in the acknowledgments in the book how Dr. Redliner really sort of helped cultivate this idea and the ideas behind this book. Nuclear conflict is one I probably wouldn't have included if I was doing this on my own. And it was really in conversation with him that I began to see how the threat had changed. And how in many ways it was actually much more survivable in the way. It's kind of counterintuitive. In some ways, the threat is the use of nuclear weapons may be more likely than it ever has been before. But the type of scenarios that we're looking at are much more localized than the global killing sort of posturing of the Cold War, which makes it much more survivable. We don't want it to happen. It's got horrible, horrible things that would come from it. It's very bad. But life on Earth could potentially survive afterwards. And even how we secure the population, how we protect ourselves from fallout is actually more relevant now than it was when these fallout shelters were set up back in the Kennedy era and in the 60s and 70s. So it really opened my eyes. And then interviewed Alex Wellerstein, a great historian on this, from the Stevens Institute in New Jersey. And again, just really really fascinating. But I think I can't imagine the book without it now, and I can't imagine thinking about these threats without it. And it just goes to show how easy it is to forget about the threats of yesterday, even though they never really went away.
Well, next week is definitely going to be incredibly interesting, especially since we'll have potentially know the winner of the election by then as well.
Possibly a lot of absentee ballots, though, and a lot of states aren't allowed to count them until the day of the election, so
Yeah.
we might not know. I think Pennsylvania said they'd have the majority by Friday, so we might not know. We could do some crazy speculation.
It could be like, how will this affect our nuclear conflict threats?
That's right. Everybody should tune in.
Well, thank you so much for joining me again this week, Jeff. We're going to roll back into just chatting, and we'll be right back.
Awesome. My pleasure.
And we're back. Okay. All right, so we have full squad here in the chat. Let's see. So Ken earlier was mentioning, did you see that the Wisconsin GOP got hacked through a phishing scam and hackers took 2.3 million out of their bank account?
Yeah, I saw that. I shouldn't laugh. It's like it's like, and no, it's actually, I mean, it's not a good thing that these things happen. It's not a good thing that they get attacked by this. It's it's very real. It'd be interesting to see if they ever find out who did it. But I mean, look, there's different kinds of folks looking to hack, and I think the ones with the highest level of sophistication are nation states and criminal syndicates, and there's a lot of money to be made, and they're making it. Yeah.
Let's see, then Disa coming in saying hello, Mike saying hello, Lee here
Hey,
saying hello.
hey.
Um, oh, question from Mike. So Jeff, what do you think about the regulation of data collection? I know I'm kind of busting out of the gate with the question here, but I watched The Social Dilemma and they advocated for this. Was curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts. I'm not sure I have an informed opinion, because there's so many trade-offs with all of this, and there's so many, like, I don't know. I find myself like always drawn to the complexity. There's a lot of like cheap answers out there on, on one side it's like, well, we're doing this for your own good and everything's more convenient, and on the other end it's like, well, look what people can do with the data now, and is it really yours or is it really someone else's? This is one of many examples in technology, I think, where our ability to collect has vastly outpaced our ability to really think through the ethics of this and to really regulate it. Although one of the more interesting things I found in researching this book, and I quote it in it, is Willis Ware, who worked for the precursor to DARPA. I think it was the Army Advanced Research Projects Agency. I don't know. I can't remember acronyms right now. It's too late. But anyway, yeah, he helped develop some of the precursors to the internet for the military. And so this was like, these were documents declassified, and I'm downloading them, and it's a scan of something like with a typewriter, like back in the day, like literally 67, 68 when these were written. And he's talking then about the ability to collect mass amounts of data, and that we shouldn't take for granted that the ability to collect is not outpacing our ability to secure it. And actually, in these papers, you can download them for free. They're fascinating. I'd say about 75, 80% of what he projects for the future is absolutely, completely true in terms of what happens. Everything from the size of computers being the size of a calculator, to the vast amounts of data, and even saying, I think I have the quote in the book where he talks about how, if we can use it to manage our affairs, couldn't the criminal enterprise also use it to manage theirs? So this is all to say that, I say that the technology is outpassing our ability to regulate it. That doesn't let us off the hook. We saw this coming. We saw this coming with the very, very beginnings of the internet. People saw this, and they didn't have a crystal ball to tell the future. They just saw the potential for it, and they saw the potential for good and the trade-offs. And I think there is value in collecting some data. I do like logging in and, Amazon knowing that I need to refill this thing that I'm logging on to refill, as creepy as that is. But I also don't like when I look at something once and then I see the ad popping up 100 times, and it makes me wonder if someone really wants to get inside my head. Can they do this? And when you start thinking about foreign governments and foreign adversaries on how they can manipulate individuals, bribe them, put together profiles, it really, as well as what we can do to there's a lot of bad stuff that can be done. And I don't think we're parsing the ethics with the same level of sophistication that it deserves. That was a long answer. Sorry about that.
Oh no, you're good. I mean, it's something that I definitely think about quite often, being on like a TV host, online, like with Twitch or Simpatico or YouTube and Instagram, Twitter, like just being an influencer. Oh my gosh, I'm an influencer. Being an influencer on the internet. There's so many times where I'll get like targeted ads for things just because I'm going through and being like, oh, I'm researching certain types of graphics or hardware for this kinds of thing. And then like for the next like few months I get like, oh, here's this and here's this. You want this new graphics card? And I'm here like,
Yeah.
I mean, I appreciate the
Yeah.
convenience of it sometimes. Because sometimes like there are really good products that get recommended, and I'm like, oh, I never would have like found this, and this is what I was looking for. Like my ergonomic mouse, like I didn't know that these were a
Yeah.
thing, and it got recommended because I was looking at ergonomic keyboards, and so I got
Yeah.
recommended ergonomic mouse. Like about a week later, but it was just like,
Yeah.
it feels weird. Like,
Well, and a friend of mine, Tim Tickle, who I interview in the book, I actually went to high school with him, so we go way back. But he talks a lot about too on how we don't even really know what the boundaries of the internet are. It was really started as very decentralized, and you have different standard settings. But what do you do? Do you lock it all up under government control, or do you? It's very decentralized, so it really relies a lot on individual behavior. A lot of these interviews too. One day I'm gonna have to pull out the director's cut or something of all the things on the cutting room floor. But he talks a lot too about someone like he's a computer security expert. He's entering into the internet with the same vulnerability as everyone else, but he's got a level of technical knowledge that very few people have. How can you expect someone? It's like the user agreements that are like 60 pages. Who reads that? Um,
Yeah, that's a whole thing. Like, no one reads the terms of service.
yeah, yeah. But if it's in there, then that can really sort of so again, I'll just sort of back to this point that I'm not a luddite. I don't think that we need to like go back to the way things were. We don't need the Windows 3.1, although that's my favorite version. DOS, you type WIN, it pops up anyway. But I think with a lot of development, right, and in general, this is a larger pattern. I think that's reflected in the book is that although it's not explicitly said this way, that human development is always defined by growth, and the more aggressive the growth, the more beneficial the development. And I'm not saying we should stop growing, but maybe there are some trade-offs with how fast we're doing it versus how ready we are for we're creating vulnerabilities and we're enhancing the threats. So that's
No, and I agree. Like, that's something, you see new iPhones or new computers every single year. And, like, so just on top of the idea of, like, well, when you have that, then you have new software updates, which can, we can't keep up security wise in regard, but then also just resources wise at the same time. Like, it
yeah,
makes sense to just kind of like mellow out for a little bit. Like, we don't need to have a new like
yeah.
iPhone every single year. It could be every other year. Like, that kind of thing.
Well, and it's always been this with a lot of software companies. You put it out and then you patch it in the field,
Mhm.
which when you're under tremendous pressure to get a marketable product out there to recoup the investment, you have shareholders you want to return on theirs. There's a lot of incentives that drive these decisions that make it very difficult to be forward looking or to tap the brakes, especially when you're in competition with other organizations that are doing that. And if every organization came together and said, okay, we're going to delay our releases and spend some more time, if that's not done correctly, it's conspiracy. It's monopolistic. There are antitrust rules against that. So, and again, I'm not saying we should tear it all down. I'm just saying there are incentives and disincentives for doing this that are often very much below the surface,
Mm.
outside of the core thinking about this. So I'm actually Ellen Carlin, who was on the show a couple of days ago, and I were working on, or a couple of weeks ago, we're kind of looking at a way to sort of explore this further, and kind of research this notion of these sort of how do these incentive structures sort of drive us one way when the doctrine is pointing us another.
Yeah, well, I would love to have you both back on when you have like that more like
Sure.
solidified research. We can go and discuss it. That sounds like it would make a
Absolutely.
really good episode.
Yeah.
Um, and I have another question from Mike. So he's like, can you give your opinion on net neutrality as you know it was repealed and frankly that kind of frightens me. How important was net neutrality to individual privacy and security?
Yeah. I'm not as well versed on this to really speak too intelligently. I mean, I think in general, I tend to be more for net neutrality. I mean, the internet was really designed on the principles of freedom. There are some legitimate concerns when you have such tremendous bandwidth that are being taken up by a very few number of apps, by especially the streaming services and things like that. But that being said, when you get to a point where you can start choosing who gets faster access than others, and paying for fast lanes and things like that, you start building inequities into the
Mhm.
system. And there's already far too many in terms of basic access. It's no longer a luxury; it's essential to have access. And now during COVID-19, right, you have a lot of kids who can't get reliable access to the internet, and everything is moved online. We've worked with communities where they're sending school buses with Wi-Fi signals so kids can sit outside the buses and do the work because they don't have internet at home. So the more you sort of manufacture these inequities into the system, the more it kind of contributes to these things. And I think it I do kind of understand both sides, but I do think that we have enough inequities in this world, and I think that for the so yeah, that's, I guess, my semi-informed opinion.
Yeah, no, I think bringing up inequities is something. It reminds me, we had Dominic Bednar on, and he was talking about just energy poverty and like just with the grid. And then when you look at the also like the internet, like like you had just mentioned, like it's no longer like a luxury item. It's an actual like utility and a necessary utility. Um, and so like electricity and the internet, it kind of brings up the question of whether or not like these should just be publicly owned at this point, um, as opposed to private like shenanigans that go on.
Yeah, I kind of have mixed feelings as well too, because then when you start having, the example people give all the time is the DMV, right? When you have
Hmm.
competition in the marketplace, you do have, it drives down costs, it drives up innovation, but at the same time, you can't, if there isn't a market for it, nobody's going to do it. And so on
Yeah.
that, I've worked a lot more on the health side with this. You have like the CDC's orphan drug program and things like that for drugs that are necessary to keep people alive, but there's not enough that anyone's going to. Vaccines have traditionally, the big companies, it's been historically a very, very difficult, very low profit, very high liability. And so getting people to invest in it is very difficult. So when we start talking about, the internet and things like that, I don't know. I wonder, well, and let's put it this way. Would you want it to fall under the Department of Homeland Security, under the Trump administration? Or if you're a Republican, would you want it to fall under the Department of Homeland Security under the Obama administration? We see how politicized things can be. We're really seeing the edges of this being frayed. And so I think there's a role. Yes, absolutely. Whether it's a quasi utility, uh, or something like that. But there is a need for government in the picture, absolutely. And usually, in my opinion, what you do is you incentivize the private sector to cover as much ground as you can, and the government fills in the gaps to make sure that no one's left behind. Um, Actually achieving that is maybe a bit harder than I'm making it sound. But I think that if government isn't there to cover the things that no one else will cover, then who's going to do it?
Yeah, that is true. Um, let's see. Comment. Oh, so question from Lee. So, she's asking, do you think there will ever be one centralized but independent to the government electoral body that manages both state and federal elections, physical booths, tech, and physical means of voting, counting, etc.? The context is that that's what the Australian Electoral Commission does. So she's wondering if we'll eventually have this in the United States.
Yeah, no.
No.
It's a great question, and I think it actually would make a lot of sense. But there's actually the primacy of states and locals is so deeply embedded in the fabric of the culture in the United States and in the Constitution that states are just not willing to give up that right. I think it's a lot like saying, will there ever be a national governing body like the United Nations actually having more authority and things like that? What it would require is nations to give up sovereignty. And in the United States, it's seen that same way in terms of elections, right? Where, and again, it was, if it's a Democrat in office and a Republican governor, they're not going to want to cede any control to a federal process. Now, I know you're talking about an independent body that's totally independent. But I just don't, which I think would make it a little easier to make the argument, but I just don't think states and local governments, they would still have to give up their control, and they would have to give it up to another, or certainly right now, there's so little trust in the independence of anything, even if it is independent. It's just the playbook is to erode the trust in that independence and then swoop in with your agenda. But I think it's just too sacred of a thing for local and state governments that they're not going to. They might come together in a coordination entity. I could see that happening. I could see a standard setting in terms of your security needs to meet these minimum standards, and them saying, I don't think they'll ever allow themselves to be required to apply to adhere to it, but it's one of those things that if you're less secure than they recommend, you've got some explaining to do. Um, so yeah, that's one of the biggest things I think we run up against in a lot of solutions we see that are effective in other countries, is that it's not as compatible with the kind of democracy and individual sort of freedom centric bottom up kind of federalism that we've defined here.
Yeah. No, so Lee was like, sometimes it feels like Americans talk about problems like there aren't solutions already being used in loads of other countries.
Yeah. I think I talked about this on the pandemics one chapter as well too. So there's this good roundup on sort of behavioral science and pandemics and what it teaches, and it
Mhm.
does get into that. When you have a cultural identity that's based around community, let me rephrase that, because there's very strong communities within the United States, but when the collective identity is based around collective good, like you'll make sacrifices for the greater good, it's easier to ask these things, and so these solutions tend to work in those contexts, and they tend not to work in more individualistic cultures. And places like the U.S. where the collective identity is individual freedom. Not to say that there isn't freedom in these others. I'm not trying to say that, but it creates a cultural barrier to adopting things that do work in other contexts. So there's a sociology to this as well too. Yeah, but I
It's
mean, it's a good point. Yeah.
it's kind of like realizing, like, if you look at the idea of freedom in the United States, it's kind of like, well, it's my freedom to do whatever the heck I want. And it's
Yeah.
like, that seems very anarchist of you. Like, that's kind of some anarchy talk.
Yeah, and that's really, I mean, the fundamental divide. You take out all of the like craziness of the politics and things like that. At the end of the day, that's really, I think, the main divide between Democrats and Republicans. Again, not counting all of the crazy crap that's going on right now, is that really driven by leadership. But you take it's is there, do we get more benefit from a larger government, or do we sacrifice too much from doing it? And we're so much further to the right on this than the rest of the world. But they're very difficult things to move, particularly, I mean, they take generations to shift thinking on these kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, we could have a whole conversation about, like, anytime I go and try to describe, it's like my political standpoint. I'm an eco-socialist. That's like what my Twitch community and everyone has labeled me. They're like, you're socialist, but because of like how you care about the planet and everything, and like healthcare and all that stuff too. I'm like, okay, cool. So that's where I stand. And so I'm like, oh, like I like Bernie like quite a bit. I wanted him. But not because like, oh, he's a socialist. It's just like, well, because he's literally speaking like common sense, and the rest of the developed nations of the world like have these things. And when I talk to my friends and family who are a lot more right of the spectrum, and they're like, oh, well, he's a communist and he's gonna take over the country, and I'm here like, if you pick him up and you drop him in Europe, he's more centrist than anything, or like a bit more right leaning. And it's been so fascinating, like having these conversations and like needing to explain to people that, like, I guess this is like the dilemma is that the United States, for the average person, there's a huge disconnect from the rest of the world, it seems like. Because like when you're living in like the EU or anything like that, like you can go and visit all these other countries because they're like just right there. But over here, we're just kind of alone. Our neighbors are Canada and Mexico, and then we have a whole lot of shenanigans in South America and all that
Yep.
too. So we're kind of alone on this side of the world. And like we're not having those kinds of conversations, it feels like, that the rest of the world is having because they're actually neighbors, is what I that's my personal thought. I'm kind of wondering if that's geography is probably playing a role in this or not, but
Yeah, and I think we have very different experiences throughout the country. So very recently, I was back so I was born in Northwest Indiana, in Hammond, Indiana, and I was there for a family situation, and basically I was in so I was actually staying in Hammond, Indiana, and you go just a couple of minutes north, and you're in Gary, Indiana, and you're in the deindustrialized Rust Belt, where all these folks who sort of lost their jobs to globalization and lifting of tariffs and things like that were all promised new jobs in the 90s. And they said, well, we're going to take care of you. We're going to retrain you. And then 20 years later, the GDP did great. The nation as a whole was doing great, but it was driven by the financial sector on the coasts. And so those job programs never came. And so a generation later, their pension plans aren't any good. They're losing. And I'm not trying to defend on this. I'm just trying to, when I was there, it was very striking. And then you've got, of the 300-400 some toxic chemicals that are known, they've all been either manufactured there or buried there. You have cancer rates that are higher than elsewhere. You drive 20 minutes south, you're in cornfields as far as the eye can see.
Hmm.
And it's very agricultural. It's very much like, so this is my space, this is my land, this is where I am. So I think about this a lot because any solutions that we need to work for the whole country, not for the 51% or the 49%, depending which side you're on and which side. So it's, this polarization is killing us. I mean, quite literally now with COVID-19, this
Yeah.
polarization of our politics is driving these wedges in what we're doing. And it's keeping us from embracing the complexity of the situation and forcing us into corners with tweets and sound bites and things like that. So I really do hope that regardless of the results of the upcoming election, that it leads to a more robust conversation across the aisle, because we can't keep going on like this.
Yeah, like this is literally we're gonna end up Mad Maxing it, like if we don't like I mean, although like I got my eyes fixed, so I'm ready for when like, everything hits the fan. So
That's right. That's right. You're not dependent on an ophthalmologist anymore.
yeah, don't have to go beat someone up to steal their glasses when every like zombies happen, but
Yep.
like
Yep. Yeah.
um a radical thought just popped in my head. I'm like, I wonder if it would be at some point, how the EU is the EU, like this, where states just literally break and become their own countries, and then we have something like the EU here. If that would be better,
I think,
maybe.
when we talk about kind of international relations, and when we were looking at COVID and how different states were reacting, was actually more of a parallel to look at the EU as a whole than it was to look at the US compared to individual countries, because the autonomy of states does start now. There, it's not a one-to-one by any means. There's a lot more, but that is a closer, I think, approximation than comparing the US to the UK or the US to France or the US to Germany, is really comparing across a regional bloc of nations. Because the independence and the primacy of states is so great. A lot of the authorities of the federal government come from, particularly when it comes to health and quarantine measures, comes from the Interstate Commerce Clause in the Constitution. They can only get involved when it affects trade between states. The taxation process, you can't necessarily legislate this, but you can attach federal dollars to it. So it's, I think you've seen the European Union sort of moving towards having levers for managing between nation states that are not wholly unlike the federal government in managing. Obviously, major differences with sovereign nations versus states, but there are some interesting comparisons there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like I was wondering because if all 50 states became their own country, or you probably maybe would see like some states decide to merge together just because of resources. Like I remember seeing on Twitter there was talks of like Washington, Oregon, and California like just become like their own like country or something like that. And we would probably see other like meshings, but it's one of those thoughts where I'm like, if we continue down this path long enough, I feel like at some point something's gonna give, and we're just gonna have to kind of like be like, all right, so do we split up in countries, or do we just kind of enjoy apocalypse time, or what do we do?
Well, I think this is why you see so many countries interfering with our elections. And we talked about the cyber vulnerabilities, but there's also the bots and the memes and the accounts
The
designed.
memes.
Yeah. And the accounts designed to suppress voting and designed, that are coming. I mean, what stake does Russia have? What stake does China have to these governments that have been demonstrated to be attempting to interfere in elections in this? And it is, if we're busy fighting internally, then we're not a player on the world stage as much. We're not a player as much in the global economy. And so there are big consequences to this. And it's a little bit of both. On one hand, we have to defend, we have to keep the family issues within the family, and
Yeah.
not let other folks come in and start messing around with that. But at the same time, these fault lines existed beforehand. They're being exploited. They're not being created. And, I think nothing, the much better situation would be to find ways to reach across the aisle, to find sort of a new paradigm to reduce the polarization. I mean, my book is about threats and vulnerabilities and how human activity is contributing to both. There's probably a broader sort of political threat and vulnerability that's been growing and growing, and uh, uh, increasing the volume of the yelling isn't gonna reverse that trend. So, but I appreciate the opportunities like this and other platforms to really talk about this and have more than a few characters or a quick soundbite to talk about it, because it allows us to dive deep on this and unpack it in ways that we're not as pressured to beat our point into someone's head.
Like, hey, vote this way now.
Right? Yeah.
Well, on that note, Jeff, once again, thank you so much for joining us. I really enjoy these conversations, and I look forward to having you on next week for your last chapter episode. Oh my gosh.
I know.
Um, but like I had mentioned, we chatted a bit earlier. We would love to have you come on regularly, however much you would like to have like more conversations, bring people on. Um, Simpatico is here like for that, and this has been awesome.
Yeah, no, it's been my pleasure as well too. I very much appreciate the conversation, the just chatting, and as well as sort of connecting virtually with the rest of the Simpatico family and viewers and other hosts. And yeah, just happy to stay engaged however you want. You can always give me a call, and always happy to connect with some other folks too and keep these conversations going. It's a blast. I appreciate it.
So, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your Thursday evening time zone
Yes,
shenanigans. And I will see you again soon.
sounds great. It's going to be. Oh, I had a whole like explosive pun for next week, but I missed it. I choked.
Oh, well, I mean, you just used the word explosive, so that'll work.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I disappointed myself. All right, next time I'll do better, I promise.
All right, I expect at least 3 nuclear puns for next
Got it.
week. All
Okay.
right. Bye. All right, lovelies. Well, I do apologize for any stuttering or dropped frames on this episode. It looks like I think I figured out what the problem is. It looks like my bitrate got reset for whatever reason, so I need to go in and adjust my actual technical settings on this. But I hope that, it was at least listenable. I see that chat has been incredibly active, and I really appreciate all the conversations you guys are having here. We have our last episode for today coming up with our incredible partner Lee. It's going to be taking place an hour from now, and her guest is Jenny. I think it's Metcalf. Um, so depending where you are, go get a snack, get some sunlight. If you're in a sunny area right now, water, hydrate. We look forward to seeing you again in an hour. And as always, stay classy, and I will see you next time.